Welcome to the Arctic Aurora LifeScience and Biotech Select monthly review for September. So this was a month marked by pretty strong macro headwinds and this affected pharma and biotech as well. We will talk about that a little bit more. But besides that, there were some pretty exciting news across the sector on COVID and on, for example, cancer data, where we had a large scientific conference taking place with some exciting data from some of our portfolio companies. We'll also dive into some minor news as well from companies and end up with fund performance. So starting with what happened on a sort of a subsector on subsector development, we probably all know at this point that general markets were down considerably during September, especially during the latter end of the month. Here exemplified by S&P 500, the black line, whereas pharma and biotech, the blue and green lines respectively for pharma and biotech indices, slightly underperformed, and then further to that, small and mid-cap biotech, exemplified by the XBI equal weighted biotech ETF, was down slightly further than that. And if we look at a longer time perspective, year to date, the sort of recovery that we saw from small mid-cap biotechs during August was kind of muted and actually reversed during the end of the month due to these headwinds, for example, the worries from China and potential rising interest rates. So with that, we'll dive into more company-specific news because there were some fundamental interesting developments. Let's just start off with COVID, and to begin with COVID vaccine news, where we saw a recommendation from the US Center of Disease Control on boosters for the Pfizer and BioNTech vaccines. So we now have, in the US at least, people aged 65 or older, risk groups, and, for example, healthcare workers that are at risk of exposure that are recommended to take the third shot of the mRNA vaccines. There were also some data from J&J showing roughly the same thing, and we're also expecting Moderna to get a similar approval, if you like, for their booster. We saw some minor news from Sanofi. If you recall, they bought a small mRNA company called Translate Bio a couple of months ago. They showed initial data from their mRNA vaccine for COVID. That data would look positive, but in the sort of competitive environment around mRNA vaccines, Sanofi decided to go on their to advance their protein subunit vaccine instead, which is what Novavax is working on. However, there have been continuous delays on that program, including filings for their vaccine. They have some pretty good data, but manufacturing-wise and regulatory-wise, there's been quite a few holdups for Novavax. Moving on to therapeutic news, there was a holdup in Humanigen's attempts to get an emergency use authorization on their data in hospitalized COVID patients. Data looked positive to us, but it appears the US FDA are looking for a larger data set to approve this drug. Regeneron announced some positive data in both hospitalized and non-hospitalized patients with their antibody cocktail treatment, and then some procurement news for Regeneron, where the US government decided to buy an additional 1.4 million doses. Lilly has a similar treatment available for COVID, and they released some news that the European Union are buying additional doses. So that went well, but something happened on October 1st. So just to mention, this did not affect September performance, but we need to mention this because there was rather big news. What happened was that Merck and Ridgeback Bio, a private company that we don't hold, announced positive results from a phase 3 trial in mild to moderate COVID-19 in non-hospitalized patients with their antiviral oral drug called molnupiravir. And this drug reduced the risk of hospitalization or death by approximately 50% compared to placebo. Even further, 8 people that received placebo eventually died from COVID-19 in the roughly 700 to 800 people study, whereas no deaths occurred in the molnupiravir arm. So the study was stopped early due to that overwhelming superiority, and Merck will file for emergency use authorization for this drug. And that was a considerable news. On Friday the 1st, Merck closed up 8.4% on the day, which is quite a large uptick for a company the size of Merck. A lateral company in our portfolio is Atea Pharmaceuticals, who are working on an oral antiviral on their own, closed nearly 20% up on this, with sort of promise that this hopefully will work as well for COVID-19 patients. So very exciting news that could set off a completely new way of treating COVID-19 as we move further. And I think we'll have opportunity to discuss this even further in the next month video. So I promised some cancer data. It was a big conference called ESMO, European Society of Medical Oncology, during September. One of the winners, if you can call it that, was Daiichi Sankyo and AstraZeneca. They presented some really strong data on their new drug Enhertu that was approved a little while ago in sort of last line patients in a specific subset of breast cancer patients. Now they moved that up to treating earlier line patients, those that didn't respond or have relapse from first line use, so the first drugs that you take for breast cancer. And their standard treatment today is Roche's Kadcyla. And I think it's fair to say that Daiichi and Astra showed very overwhelming data in favor of Enhertu. So looking at exactly how large that treatment effect was, if you look at the graph in the bottom right corner, where Enhertu is represented by the blue line, Kadcyla standard of care by the gray line. So for each downtick on this graph, as the line moves to the right in time, every downtick represents a patient that either progresses with their disease or die from the disease. And the line separates very quickly in favor of Enhertu. In fact, it represents a 72% risk reduction of progression or death in favor of Enhertu. So that's very strong data. I think we'll soon see a new label for Enhertu in this setting. Mirati, another interesting biotech company, they have been neck to neck with Amgen in a new treatment for a very well-known cancer-driving mutation known as KRAS. Amgen's drug was approved a little while ago. Mirati slightly behind, but are now producing data that looks very much competitive. In terms of overall response, we have seen already that they are quite similar in lung cancer. Progression-free survival even favors Mirati's drug adagrasib over Lumakras, but these are relatively small patient populations, so we shouldn't read through too much into this. For these two drugs, previously data in colorectal cancer was slightly underwhelming, but what these two companies decided to do was combine their respective drugs with standard of care treatments for colorectal cancer, and there they managed to significantly increase response rates. And again, it looks like Mirati's drug are edging above Amgen's. So promising future for Mirati based on this data and on the competitive differences with Amgen, that hopefully they can make up for the time difference in launching their product. So moving further with other biotech news, I'll hand over to Mark actually to talk about some other big movers in the biotech sector.
Neil, let's talk about Aurora. As you can see on the stock chart, the rally in Aurora stock price continued from August, and the main reason behind that was the continued positive sentiment around the launch of Lupkynis, the company's drug, which is the first oral therapy for active lupus nephritis and was approved this January. Lupus nephritis is an autoimmune disease where the patient's own immune system attacks their own tissues and organs, and the target in this disease is mainly the kidneys. So consequently, the main symptoms of the disease are kidney inflammation, blood or protein in the urine, high blood pressure, swelling, and ultimately kidney failure. So this is a very severe and debilitating disease. And apart from addressing this need, the positive sentiment was fueled by the company's revenue guidance. Even though year to date they generated only $7.2 million in revenue, the management guided towards $40–50 million in revenue for the whole year. To reinforce that, the company also disclosed that they received more than 800 patient start forms year to date, so that looks very promising. If we move on to another company, Protagonist, we can see that they had a fairly good performance year to date, but then suddenly the stock price plummeted in the middle of September. And the reason for that was that the FDA put a hold on all clinical trials related to rusfertide, the company's main drug candidate, developed in rare iron homeostasis disorders. And the reason for this clinical hold was actually a preclinical finding that skin tumors started to appear in a long-term mouse study, which is of course a very concerning finding for the ongoing clinical trials. Besides that, the company also disclosed that there were actually 4 cancer cases in the human trials that they believed were unrelated to the treatment, but this new preclinical finding also puts these developments in a different light. So this issue will probably take some time to resolve. And with that, I give the word back to Daniel.
Mark, so we'll move on to some miscellaneous news in our portfolio with some fairly big movers during the month. Begin with the CNS company Axsome that had a big drop previously due to a so-called not a complete response letter. Sorry, they got a letter from the FDA citing some deficiencies in their data package for a depression filing, so a regulatory filing for the new depression drug. Now, the rejection has never come, which is interesting because usually that follows these deficiency letters, and so I think some investors are reading sort of between the lines that FDA may have take a lenient stance on this. We don't know. There's no transparency on this, so we just have to follow that case. However, they also have a migraine drug that went through successful phase 3 trials, and they are now filing for that drug. So I think the rest of the portfolio in Axsome is progressing, and that accounts for the 28% increase in market value during September. We had some very anticipated CRISPR gene editing news from Editas in a rare childhood blindness disease. I think data there was quite inconclusive. These were pretty severe patients, so I guess expectations weren't sky high on being able to reverse blindness, for example, but still data, I think consensus was they were quite underwhelming, and Editas underperformed, as should we say, other CRISPR companies in this macro environment where previous winners during the year took a particular hit. So that included Editas and the likes of CRISPR Therapeutics, Intellia Therapeutics, for example. Those are CRISPR names. 2 big pharma companies had some bad news from the US FDA, and that regards restrictions for their new inflammatory drugs, so-called JAK inhibitors. That actually has produced some quite interesting good clinical effects versus standard of care today. However, there are some concerns over safety of these products, and that we believe it will limit the commercial uptake for these products. And subsequently, these 2 stocks took a pretty good hit during September for Pfizer and AbbVie that had these products. We should note that we don't have AbbVie in our portfolio. TG Therapeutics announced that they'll file for their multiple sclerosis drug and also produce some compelling data in leukemia for a combination of their two pipeline drugs that send the stock up 23% during the month. Back to ESMO that we mentioned with regards to Daiichi and Astra. One company that didn't quite deliver was TCR² Therapeutics, a cell therapy for solid cancers. There were some safety concerns which led to a halt in the dosing escalation for their candidate cell therapy treatment. The data update in terms of clinical effect was quite underwhelming. On the other hand, Mirum Pharmaceuticals, a company related to Aurora Pharma, another portfolio company of ours, got their approval in a rare liver disorder. The first drug approved for this disease called Alagille syndrome, so positive for patients there, and we saw some very good data in clinical trials for this drug. So good news there for a patient group with large medical needs. We should also mention two companies that we didn't hold in the portfolio, but is essential for the biotech theme, and that's merger and acquisitions. Two companies were acquired during September: Acceleron for 11.5 billion, and Cadmon to Sanofi for 2 billion. I should say that Merck was the company that acquired Acceleron. So I think we are sensing the M&A climate heating up as small mid-cap biotech market values are certainly a fair bit lower than they were in the beginning of the year. Wrapping up with our fund performances this month, so considerable headwinds, as we mentioned, from the macro side. Article Aurora LifeScience ended the month down 4.7%, which is actually 1% better than our benchmark. Biotech Select was down 5.2%, so an additional downtick for small cap biotech. I think we can read into that. And if we look at individual companies on the contribution side, we mentioned most of these names already. Aurora did particularly well. Atea actually did well, but this was before the Merck news. AstraZeneca, on top of the good data from ESMO, we mentioned Axsome, TG, and then Protagonist was the outlier on the negative side. A pretty considerable drop there, as you can see, due to the negative news on their development program. Very similar names for most of it in ABS. We also saw Verve Therapeutics. That's another CRISPR name that, since their IPO, has done particularly well and was hit by the macro environment in this case. So before we end today's video, just a few things to look forward to during October or Q4. Some of these clinical trial readouts, it's quite difficult to know when they actually will occur. We do know that the so-called triple meeting, a highly anticipated another cancer conference, will take place in October. We have a few of our portfolio companies that will present interesting data during that conference. We also know that Gilead will present data during Q4. We don't know exactly when that will be, on two assets that they fairly recently acquired. So that will be a good indicator of Gilead's business development capabilities if these clinical trials are successful. The first one is regarding Trodelvy. That was the Immunomedics acquisition a year ago. And the second one is Magrolimab, a company that they also acquired roughly a year ago, called 47. And as we did mention, the Merck news on their antiviral, we are expecting phase 3 data from Atea Pharmaceuticals that are partnered with Roche on their antiviral. So we're very excited to see if they can match Merck's efficacy on the oral antivirals for COVID-19. So with that, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next month with hopefully even more exciting news. Goodbye.